My name is Genevieve, and I am 33 years old. For 10 years, I poured my heart, soul, and my father's legacy into our family's restaurant, the Hearth. I was the chef, the creative force, the keeper of the flame. My brother, Julian, was the numbers guy, the pragmatist. After our father died, I thought we were partners, building on his dream together. That is, until the day my brother and my own mother called a surprise meeting to fire me from my own kitchen, claiming I was too emotional and not focused enough on profit margins. They thought they had stolen my future and my father's legacy in one clean, brutal cut. What they didn't know was that they had only stolen the recipe book, not the chef. And a chef knows that revenge is a dish best served cold. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you are viewing from. Before I tell you how I turned their betrayal into my greatest triumph, hit like and subscribe to hear more true stories about family, betrayal, and the sweet taste of justice. Before my life was cleaved in two, it was a symphony of comforting routines. The Hearth wasn't just my job, it was my home. My father, Arthur, a chef with more passion than business sense, had opened it 20 years ago. It was a cozy, beloved neighborhood institution famous for its rustic, soulful food. He taught me everything I knew, his calloused hands guiding mine as I learned to knead dough, to properly sear a steak, to understand that the best ingredients were love and patience. When he passed away from a sudden heart attack, Julian and I inherited the restaurant 50-50. It felt like his final wish for his two children to carry on his dream. Julian, 5 years my senior, had never shown an interest in cooking. He had a business degree and a mind like a spreadsheet. He saw the Hearth not as a legacy, but as an asset with underperforming metrics. Dad never modernized, he'd say, pointing at the worn wooden tables. We're leaving money on the table with this cozy aesthetic. Our mother, Beatrice, always took his side. Since our father's death, she had become Julian's echo. "Your brother knows business, Genevieve," she'd remind me. "You're the artist, he's the strategist. You should listen to him." For a few years, we found a fragile balance. I ran the kitchen, preserving the quality and soul of my father's food. Julian ran the front of the house, streamlining inventory and optimizing staff schedules. I thought our differences were our strength. I was the heart, he was the brain. But slowly, things began to change. Julian started making small, unilateral decisions. He switched our local organic vegetable supplier for a cheaper, industrial one. "The customers won't notice the difference," he'd insist when I confronted him. "They will notice, Julian," I'd argue back. "This is a tomato that tastes like water. Dad would never have allowed this in his kitchen." "Dad isn't here anymore," he'd reply, his voice cold. "And his sentimentality is why this place was barely breaking even for years." The cuts became deeper. He replaced the high-quality olive oil with a cheaper blend, the fresh-baked bread from a local artisan with frozen pear-baked rolls. Each change was a small betrayal, a chipping away at the foundation of everything my father had built. Our arguments became more frequent, more bitter. Each time I would appeal to our mother, and each time she would side with Julian. "You're being too emotional, Genevieve," she'd say, her tone of gentle disappointment. "This is a business, not a memory box. Julian is trying to ensure our family's financial future. You should be grateful." Grateful. I was working 70 hours a week, covered in burns and sweat, trying to maintain the integrity of my father's life's work, and I was supposed to be grateful that my brother was systematically destroying it in the name of a higher profit margin? The final, unforgivable betrayal came on a rainy Tuesday, the slowest night of the week. Julian and my mother asked me to meet them in the office after service. I assumed it was for another argument about the cost of fresh herbs. I walked in, exhausted and smelling of garlic and thyme, to find them sitting behind the desk, their faces grim and set. A man in a suit I didn't recognize sat beside them. "Genevieve," Julian began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Mom and I have made an executive decision. We feel the restaurant needs to move in a new creative direction, a more profitable one." "What do you mean?" I asked, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. "We've hired a new executive chef," said my mother, refusing to meet my eyes. "His name is Jeffrey. He has a wonderful background in corporate hospitality. He understands efficiency and scalability." The man in the suit, Jeffrey, gave me a tight, condescending smile. "As of tonight, your employment at the Hearth is terminated," said Julian. The words didn't feel real. Fired. From my own restaurant. From my father's legacy. "You can't do this," I whispered, looking from my brother's cold face to my mother's averted gaze. "I own half of this restaurant. We're prepared to buy you out." Julian slid a folder across the desk. "For a very generous price, considering your disruptive influence on the business lately." They were framing me as the problem. My insistence on quality was a disruptive influence? It was a coup, planned and executed behind my back. "There's one more thing," Julian said. "You'll need to leave Dad's recipe book, the black leather one. It's a company asset." "No," I said, the word catching in my throat. "Absolutely not." Julian sighed, a look of theatrical pity on his face. "I was afraid you'd be difficult. It's a good thing I made photocopies last week." He had planned it all the last cruel detail. I stood there, stripped of my job, my inheritance, my father's memory, all in the space of 5 minutes. I walked out of that office, past the kitchen where my team was cleaning up, and into the rainy night, not as a partner, but as a trespasser. They thought they had won. They thought they had taken everything. But as I stood on that wet pavement, the anger began to burn away the shock. They had the book, but I had the memory. I had the skill. I had the fire. And I decided right then and there that I would use it to burn their new, profitable, soulless world to the ground. The first week was a blur of grief and rage. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. out of habit, my body ready to head to the market for fresh produce, for a kitchen that was no longer mine. The buyout offer they had presented was insultingly low, a fraction of what my half was truly worth, and I knew accepting it would be an admission of defeat. I ignored the calls from my mother and the formal emails from Julian's lawyer. I was paralyzed, adrift in a sea of betrayal. The knock on my apartment door came a week later. It was Samuel, the head waiter from the Hearth, a kind, dignified man in his late 60s who had worked for my father since the day the restaurant opened. He held a cardboard box in his hands. "I quit the day after they fired you," he said simply, his eyes filled with a sad anger. "I will not stand by and watch those two destroy everything Arthur built. A dozen of us walked out with me. The heart of the restaurant is gone, Genevieve." His words were a balm to my wounded soul. I hadn't been alone in my fight for quality. "What's in the box?" I asked, gesturing to what he was holding. He smiled for the first time. "Your father's good knives. I saw that new fellow, Jeffrey, handling them like they were cheap cleavers. I couldn't let him. Arthur would have wanted you to have them. And this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the black leather recipe book. My heart stopped. "How?" I whispered. "Julian is a fool," Samuel said with a twinkle in his eye. "He made photocopies, yes, but he left the original on the desk. I took it before I left. A restaurant's soul isn't in a photocopy." I took the book, its worn leather familiar in my hands, and for the first time in a week, I felt a flicker of hope.
I had my father's knives, and I had his book. I had the soul of the hearth. It was Samuel who planted the seed of the idea. They can steal a location, but they can't steal your talent, he said as we sat in my living room drinking tea. You are the hearth. Without you, it's just another soulless place with overpriced, mediocre food. But they have the location, the name, the money, I said, the despair creeping back. We have the loyalty, he corrected me. The old customers, the staff. We just need a new place to gather. And then I saw it. A for lease sign had gone up in the building directly across the street from the hearth. It was a smaller space, a former bookstore that had gone out of business. It was run down, but the location was a declaration of war. That afternoon, Samuel and I met with a commercial real estate agent. The space needed a complete overhaul. The electrical was ancient, it needed a commercial kitchen installed, new plumbing, everything. The cost was staggering. The buyout money from Julian wouldn't even cover the down payment for the lease, let alone the renovations. I spent the next week drafting a business plan with the same manic intensity I usually reserved for creating a new menu. I laid out my vision, a restaurant that was the spiritual successor to my father's dream, built on quality, community, and soul. I would call it Arthur's Table. At the end of the week, I walked into the bank with my detailed plan and my father's recipe book tucked in my bag for courage. I met with a loan officer, a stern-looking woman named Miss Margot Sterling, who listened to my pitch with a skeptical expression. "Ms. Beaumont, your passion is admirable," she said, looking over my financials, "but passion doesn't pay the bills. You have no capital, and you're trying to launch a high-risk venture in a competitive market directly opposite an established business. An established business that just fired its head chef and lost a third of its staff," I countered. An established business that has started cutting corners on quality. The fact that the neighborhood foodies are already starting to notice. She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. I pushed on, my confidence growing. My father built a legacy of trust with this community. My brother is squandering it. I'm not just opening a restaurant. I'm reclaiming my family's name and my father's honor. I don't know if it was my speech, the meticulous detail of my business plan, or the quiet dignity of Samuel, who had insisted on coming with me, but something shifted in Miss Sterling's eyes. "I'll tell you what," she said, closing the folder. "I can't approve this on my own, but my father was a huge fan of the hearth. He used to say that your father was the only honest chef in the city. I'll take this proposal to the board. Don't get your hopes up, but don't give up either." The 2 weeks I waited for the bank's decision were the longest of my life. In that time, the rest of the staff who had quit with Samuel came to me, offering to help. My old sous chef, Finn, my pastry chef, Nora, they all pledged their loyalty. We spent our days painting the walls of the new space and our nights gathered in my apartment, testing new recipes, planning menus, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of righteous purpose. Finally, the call came. Miss Sterling was on the other end. "The board was skeptical," she began, and my heart sank. "But I may have shown them a few of the recent online reviews for the hearth that mentioned disappointing changes and not what it used to be. And then I told them my father's favorite story about yours. They've approved the loan." I dropped the phone, shouting with a joy so pure it felt like I could fly. We had a chance. The war was on.
The next 3 months were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Every dollar from the loan was stretched to its limit. My team of loyal staff became a team of construction workers, painters, and decorators. We worked from dawn until long past midnight, transforming the dusty old bookstore into a warm, inviting space. We built the tables ourselves from reclaimed wood. I scoured flea markets for vintage plates and silverware, creating an eclectic, soulful aesthetic that was the antithesis of Julian's cold, corporate vision for the hearth. From our front windows, we had a direct view of our rival. We watched as they put up a new, generic sign. We saw the delivery trucks from the industrial food suppliers. We saw the new staff, dressed in stiff, formal uniforms. And we saw the customers, fewer and fewer each week, leaving with disappointed looks on their faces. Julian and my mother often stood at their own window, watching our progress with expressions that soured from curiosity to annoyance to outright alarm. The day we opened Arthur's table was the scariest and most exhilarating day of my life. We didn't have money for a big marketing campaign, just a simple sign in the window and a post on a local food blog. But the word had spread through the network of loyal customers and former staff. An hour before we opened, a line had formed down the block. When Samuel opened the doors, the small restaurant was flooded with familiar faces, people who had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries at the Hearth for years. "We came back for your cooking, Genevieve!" one of them shouted, and the room erupted in applause. The night was a blur of fire, steam, and adrenaline. My team, my family of choice, moved with a seamless grace born of shared passion. The food we sent out was the best I had ever cooked. It was my father's legacy, refined and elevated. It was food made with love, a concept I knew Jeffrey, the corporate chef across the street, would never understand. At the end of the night, after the last happy customer had left, my team gathered in the kitchen. We were exhausted, sore, and covered in food, but we were victorious. We had done the impossible. The success of Arthur's table was immediate and overwhelming. We were booked solid for weeks in advance. The city's top food critic gave us a glowing 4-star review, calling us the rightful heir to Arthur Beaumont's culinary legacy, and noting that the Hearth across the street had sadly lost its soul. That review was the first major blow to Julian's empire. His restaurant, once a beloved institution, was now a public disappointment. His profit margins, I imagined, were beginning to suffer. My mother, Beatrice, was the first to crack. She showed up at my restaurant one afternoon unannounced during the lull between lunch and dinner service. "Genevieve, we need to talk," she said, her voice strained. "You're embarrassing the family." "I'm embarrassing the family?" I asked, wiping down a counter. "I'm the one getting rave reviews. Julian is the one getting reviews that say his food tastes like it came from an airplane." "He's your brother," she insisted. "You're destroying his livelihood." "He tried to destroy mine first, Mom. He fired me and tried to steal my inheritance. This isn't a game I started, but it's one I intend to finish." "He's offering a truce," she said, her tone softening. "He wants to merge. We could be a family again. The Hearth by Arthur's table. We could have both locations." The offer was so quintessentially Julian. He had tried to crush me, failed, and now he wanted to absorb my success, to rebrand his failure with my victory. "Tell Julian the answer is no," I said, my voice firm. "Arthur's table will never have his name attached to it. This place is built on honesty and quality. He doesn't understand the meaning of either." She left in a storm of tears and accusations of my cold-heartedness. But I wasn't cold. I was clear. I had spent my entire life accommodating their needs, and I was done. The final act of my revenge, however, was yet to come. It wasn't something I had planned, but an opportunity that fell into my lap, a piece of information that would give me the ultimate checkmate in our bitter family game. The opportunity arrived in the form of a nervous young man who came to my restaurant's back door one evening after closing. He introduced himself as a former line cook from the Hearth. He had been fired by Jeffrey for questioning the quality of a recent shipment of seafood. "He's a nightmare to work for," the young cook said, his hands fidgeting. "But that's not why I'm here. It's about your brother. He's cutting more than just quality corners. He's breaking the law." He went on to explain that Julian, in his desperate attempt to increase profit margins, had made a deal with a new meat supplier. This supplier was notorious for skirting health regulations and dealing in mislabeled, often inferior products. "They're selling him grade C beef and passing it off as prime on the menu," the cook explained. "And I'm pretty sure some of the fish we got last week was previously frozen, not fresh like the menu claims. It's fraud, chef, and it's dangerous. He had documents, invoices, delivery slips, emails between Julian and the supplier. He had been so disgusted by the deception that he had been secretly making copies. He handed me a thick envelope. "I respected your father," he said quietly. "He would never have stood for this. I thought you should know." I took the envelope, my mind racing. This was more than just a confirmation of Julian's greed. This was a public health risk. This was a betrayal not just of our father's legacy, but of every customer who walked through their doors. I had my weapon. The question was how to use it. I could go to the health department, but that felt anonymous, too clean. I could leak it to the press, but that felt vindictive. No, this required a more personal touch. It required a public reckoning. My opportunity came a week later. The city was hosting its annual Taste of the Town food festival, a major event where all the top restaurants set up booths to showcase their food to thousands of attendees and a panel of esteemed judges. Both the Hearth and Arthur's Table were scheduled to participate. Julian, I knew, would see this as his chance to reclaim his restaurant's reputation. He would be there, schmoozing, smiling, serving his fraudulent prime beef sliders to the unsuspecting public. On the day of the festival, our two booths were set up, ironically, almost side by side. Arthur's Table was swarmed with people, a long line of eager customers waiting to try our signature braised short rib. The Hearth's booth was noticeably quieter. Julian was there, dressed in an expensive suit, a forced smile plastered on his face. My mother was with him, playing the part of the proud matriarch. I waited until the main event, the chef's showcase, where the head chefs from the top 5 restaurants, a list which to Julian's visible fury included me, but not him, were invited on stage to do a live cooking demonstration. As I was finishing my presentation, the host, a famous local food blogger, opened the floor for questions. This was my moment. "I actually have a question for one of the other chefs here today," I said into the microphone, my voice ringing out across the crowded plaza. I turned to look directly at my brother, who was standing by his booth. "Julian Beaumont of the Hearth? I was wondering if you could tell us all a little bit about your new prime beef supplier. I hear they offer some truly unbelievable prices." A camera swung to find Julian, projecting his suddenly pale, panicked face onto the giant screens on either side of the stage. He was trapped. He couldn't ignore the question in front of hundreds of people, including every major food critic and journalist in the city. "We work with a variety of excellent local purveyors," he stammered, his voice tight. "Really? Because I have invoices right here from a company called Quality Meats, Inc., a supplier that was fined by the FDA last year for mislabeling products, a company that is currently under investigation for health code violations. Are they one of your excellent purveyors?" I held up a copy of one of the invoices for the camera to see. The crowd began to murmur. My mother looked like she was about to faint. Julian's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He knew he was beaten. He had been exposed, publicly and devastatingly, not just as a bad chef, but as a liar and a fraud. He turned and pushed his way through the crowd, my mother scrambling to follow him. They abandoned their booth, leaving their plates of perfectly arranged fraudulent sliders behind. The silence that followed was broken by a single person in the crowd who started to clap. Then another. Within seconds, the entire plaza was applauding. Not for my cooking,
but for the truth.
The fallout from the food festival was immediate and catastrophic for the Hearth. The city's health department launched a full-scale investigation the very next day, prompted by the public accusations and the evidence I provided to a journalist immediately after the showcase. They found numerous violations, confirming that Julian had been knowingly buying and serving mislabeled, inferior meat. The restaurant was shut down pending a hearing. The story was on the front page of the city newspaper. Hearthless, beloved restaurant closed amid fraud allegations. The article detailed the family drama, my public takedown of my brother, and the subsequent investigation. Julian and my mother went into hiding. Their phones turned off, their social media accounts deleted. 2 weeks later, facing insurmountable legal fees, public disgrace, and the permanent revocation of their food license, they were forced to declare bankruptcy. The Hearth, my father's legacy, the institution my brother had tried to steal, was dead. The bank foreclosed on the property, and all its assets were scheduled for auction. It should have felt like a complete victory, the perfect revenge. But as I watched the news reports, all I felt was a profound sense of emptiness. I had won the war, but the cost had been the complete and utter destruction of my family. It was Mr. Abernathy who called me with the final piece of news. "The restaurant property is going up for auction next month," he said. "The bank is starting the bidding low to ensure the quick sale." An idea, bold and audacious, began to form in my mind. Is it possible to bid anonymously through a holding company? "Of course," he replied, a hint of a smile in his voice. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" "It was my father's dream," I said softly. "It feels wrong to let it just disappear, or worse, become a chain coffee shop." On the day of the auction, I sat in Mr. Abernathy's office while he placed the bids for me over the phone. There were a few other interested parties, but their interest was in the real estate, not the restaurant itself. My final bid was accepted. It was a fraction of what the property was worth, a bargain born from my brother's disgrace. I was now the sole owner of the building where my father had built his dream, the very place I had been fired from months before. I didn't tell anyone what I had done, not at first. For a month, the building sat empty, a dark, silent presence across the street from the bright, bustling energy of Arthur's table. Then I began the work. I hired a crew, not to demolish, but to restore. We stripped away all of Julian's cold, corporate additions. We sanded the floors back to their original warm oak. We reinstalled the cozy, intimate lighting my father had loved. I didn't restore it to be a second restaurant. I had a different vision. 3 months later, a new sign went up. The Arthur Beaumont Culinary Foundation. I had transformed my father's restaurant into a nonprofit community kitchen and a tuition-free culinary school for underprivileged youth. It would be a place where the next generation of chefs, the ones with passion but not privilege, could learn the craft, just as my father had taught me. It would be a true legacy, one built on giving back, not on profit margins. The grand opening was a quiet event. I invited the community, the loyal customers, my team from Arthur's table, and all the people who had supported me. Samuel stood beside me as I cut the ribbon, his eyes shining with tears. He said, "Arthur would have loved this more than anything. This is the real Hearth." As the event was winding down, I saw a lone figure standing across the street, watching from the shadows. It was my mother. She looked older, smaller than I remembered. She just stood there for a long moment, looking at the new sign, at the lights and life pouring out of the building. Then she turned and walked away. It wasn't a reconciliation,
not even a beginning of one, but it felt like a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement. A recognition, perhaps, of what had been lost and what in its place had been built.
A year has passed since the opening of the foundation. Arthur's table continues to thrive, a testament to the idea that quality and soul are good business. The culinary foundation has become the true heart of the neighborhood, its kitchens bustling with aspiring young chefs, its dining room often used for community dinners for the elderly and those in need. I split my time between both places, my life richer and more fulfilling than I could have ever imagined. I never heard from Julian again. I heard through the grapevine that he moved to another state, taking a mid-level management job in a different industry, the brilliant venture capitalist humbled and erased. My mother sends me a simple, unsigned card on my birthday each year. It's a small, fragile gesture, a thread of connection I haven't yet decided whether to pull or to snip. The pain of her betrayal has faded into a dull ache, replaced by the vibrant, demanding life I have built. My revenge was not in my brother's destruction, but in my own creation. I didn't just win the battle, I changed the very nature of the war. I took the legacy he tried to corrupt and transformed it into something bigger, better, and more generous than he could ever have conceived. My father taught me how to cook, but my brother, in his greed and cruelty, taught me a far more valuable lesson, that the best revenge isn't about tearing something down. It's about building something so beautiful and strong that the wreckage of the past is simply forgotten in its shadow. I had honored my father, I had found my own purpose, and I had created a legacy that would feed a community in more ways than one. And that was a victory far sweeter than any dish I could ever create. Had you ever had a professional betrayal that was deeply personal? How did you find the strength to rebuild and move forward? I would love to hear your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If this story of resilience resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe for more real-life stories. Remember that your greatest success can often grow from the ashes of your deepest betrayals. Thank you for listening.